He never asked me for money. He just made it harder to refuse. We were standing in line at the pharmacy, both of us waiting longer than we should have. He glanced from the screen to me and said, "Thank you for being patient." Not patient with him, but patient with the delay itself, as if my willingness to wait was a resource he'd quietly started managing. I was 56 then, recently promoted into a role no one congratulates you for. Chief Risk Officer at a regional credit union. I didn't manage people so much as thresholds, exposure, language that decided whether money moved or stopped. My income was steady, my authority narrow but absolute within its lane. He wore a uniform, not military security, private contractor, mall-level insignia, shoes too clean for the job to be permanent. He said he worked nights and that pharmacies were quieter in the morning. He said it like a fact, not an invitation. We nodded at each other after that. Once, then again the following week. The third time, he remembered my name from the label on my bottle and apologized for it, said it was hard not to notice when you stood next to someone long enough. He told me he was between contracts, that security work was mostly gaps stitched together. He said he didn't mind the uncertainty, but that it made planning difficult. He said some systems punish people for not fitting neatly. That language felt familiar. I told him I worked in finance. He didn't ask where. He said money was mostly fear management anyway. I noticed how carefully he kept his eyes level when he said it. We started having coffee after those chance meetings. Always at the same place. Always brief. He paid sometimes. I paid sometimes. He never insisted. He talked about his past in fragments. A divorce finalized without drama. A brother who borrowed too often. A mother who worried in advance. He framed each story around responsibility, not grievance. He said he liked knowing where he stood. The first time he asked me for advice, it was abstract. He said he'd been offered a contract that required bonding. He said the terms were confusing, and that he didn't trust the explanation he'd been given. He asked how people evaluated risk when information was partial. I answered the way I always did. Slowly, without conclusion. He listened closely. Then he said that made sense. He didn't ask what he should do. He just absorbed it. A week later, he said he'd turned the contract down. He said the bonding requirement didn't match the compensation. He said he felt better having declined it cleanly. I remember thinking that he made decisions the way I did. That was probably when I started trusting him. Not emotionally. Structurally. He didn't move into my life. He positioned himself beside it. We didn't text constantly. We didn't share mornings. We met in the margins. Coffee after my early meetings, short walks between errands, a drink once a week that never turned into dinner unless I suggested it. He said routine kept things honest. I noticed how rarely he asked direct questions. Instead, he offered observations about how systems failed at the seams, about how people confused authority with certainty, about how rules were often written to protect institutions, not individuals. He never sounded bitter, just precise. When I spoke about my work, I kept it general. I didn't mention thresholds or internal flags. I didn't need to. He seemed to understand the logic without the specifics. That felt rare. At some point, he mentioned a problem. Not his, a friend's. He said the friend had taken out a small business loan through a credit union that was now tightening conditions unexpectedly. He said the language was vague, the penalties unclear. He asked hypothetically how often lenders adjusted risk posture without formal notice. I answered in general terms. Market shifts, regulatory pressure, portfolio rebalancing. I didn't mention my own institution. He nodded. He said it was unfortunate when transparency lagged behind policy. He said trust eroded faster than capital. A week later, he said the friend had defaulted. He didn't dramatize it. He said it calmly, like reporting weather. He said the business would probably survive, but that the process had been destabilizing. He said he hated seeing people blindsided. I noticed how often his stories involve someone else being treated unfairly by a system. He never framed himself as a victim. He started asking more about my days. Not details, pressure points. where decisions piled up, where ambiguity lived. He listened the way people do when they're mapping terrain, not sympathizing. One evening after a long day, I mentioned that our institution was reviewing contractor accounts more aggressively. I said it casually as context for why I was tired. He paused. Then he said that made sense. He said security firms were often overexposed without realizing it. He said cash flow in that sector was fragile by design. I asked how he knew that. He said he'd seen it happen. After that, he grew more careful with his own finances, or at least that's how it appeared. He mentioned turning down work that paid well but required upfront costs. He said he didn't like leverage he couldn't see clearly. I found that reassuring. The first time money crossed the space between us, it was incidental. We were out for coffee and his card declined. Not dramatically, just once. He laughed, said he'd transferred funds too late the night before. I paid without comment. He thanked me and sent the money back before I got home. That mattered to me more than the amount. He began to say things like, "I trust your judgment and you think in ranges, not absolutes." He said it admiringly, not dependently. He didn't ask me to decide for him. He asked me to explain how I decided. I told myself that was intimacy, not influence. When he mentioned that his current contract required a personal guarantee he wasn't comfortable with, I listened carefully. He didn't ask for help. He just described the dilemma and let it sit. I didn't offer a solution. I offered reassurance instead. I said walking away was sometimes the most disciplined choice. He smiled and said that was why he liked talking to me. The pivot came quietly, through a question that sounded like concern. He said one morning that his current contract had been flagged for review. Not terminated, just paused. He said the firm's credit union had asked for additional documentation, cash flow projections, guarantor confirmations, updated bonding language. He said it was routine, but that routine had a way of stalling people who lived between pay cycles. He didn't ask me to look at anything. He asked whether that kind of review usually meant trouble. I answered honestly. I said reviews were often protective gestures, not punishments. I said they were meant to slow exposure, not assign blame. I said outcomes depended on how clearly risk was framed. He listened, then said that helped. A few days later, he mentioned that the review had escalated. He said the institution wanted assurance that he wasn't overextended across multiple contracts. He said they were nervous about concentration risk. That phrasing was precise enough to register. I asked which institution. He said a mid-sized credit union based 2 counties over. He said he'd never dealt with them directly before, but that his firm used them for bonding and payroll services. I said nothing. That night, I noticed my own workday linger longer than usual. I reread a memo about contractor exposure limits. I noticed language that could be interpreted broadly. I told myself that was coincidence. The next week, he asked if I would do him a favor. Not professional, personal. He said the review team wanted a character reference. Someone outside the firm who could speak to his reliability. He said it wasn't standard, but that the request had been framed as reassurance rather than requirement. He said he'd thought of me because I understood risk without dramatizing it. I hesitated. He noticed and immediately softened the ask. He said I could decline. He said he didn't want to blur lines. He said he trusted my judgment more than the outcome. That was what tipped it. I agreed to write something brief. General. No institution named. No guarantees. Just a statement of how I knew him and how he approached responsibility. I wrote it carefully. I removed adjectives. I kept it factual. He thanked me and didn't mention it again. 2 days later, I received an internal alert at work. Not about him. About a cluster of contractor accounts under review for exposure overlap. The summary mentioned security services, bonding instruments, and personal guarantees tied to inconsistent cash flows. No names. Still, I felt a tightening. When I saw him that evening, he was lighter. He said the review had gone well. He said the reference had helped frame things. He said the tone had shifted from suspicion to clarification. I asked whether the credit union had requested anything else. He said no. He said things were settling. After that, his confidence changed. Not dramatically, subtly. He spoke with more certainty about upcoming contracts. He stopped qualifying timelines. He said things like once this clears instead of if. He also began to ask more specific questions about my work. Not thresholds, but process. Who reviewed what? How often exceptions were revisited? Whether informal signals mattered as much as formal ones. I answered cautiously. I kept it abstract. I told myself abstraction was safe. What I didn't notice at first was how my answers began to anticipate his questions. How I framed explanations to be useful, not just accurate. How often I found myself thinking this would help him understand instead of this is how it works. One evening, he said something that landed wrong. He said it was strange how much easier things became once the right person vouched for you. He said trust traveled faster than documentation. I asked what he meant by right person. He smiled and said he meant someone who understood the system from the inside. I told myself that was a compliment. Didn't feel like one. The confirmation arrived at work, not through him. It was a routine briefing, one of the standing risk summaries that crossed my desk every Thursday. No names, no narratives, just patterns, concentration clusters, exception dependencies, accounts whose stability relied too heavily on non-financial assurances. One line held me longer than the others. Recent third-party character references appear to have influenced exposure posture beyond documented criteria. I read it twice. The phrasing was careful. Nobody was being accused. But the implication was clear enough to sting. Influence had entered a lane where it wasn't supposed to exist. I didn't think of him immediately. I thought of myself. That evening when we met for coffee, I watched him more closely than I had before. He was relaxed, unburdened. He talked about a contract extension that was all but confirmed. He said the firm was relieved the review had settled. He said clarity made people generous. I asked what documentation had ultimately satisfied them. He shrugged. He said sometimes reassurance mattered more than numbers. He said systems were run by people and people like signals they recognized. I asked whether my reference had been shared internally. He said of course. He said it had been circulated as context, not evidence. He said it had helped them understand his profile more holistically. That word, circulated, landed differently than submitted. I asked who else had seen it. He hesitated, just long enough. Then he said he wasn't sure. He said once things entered review channels, distribution widened. He said that was how transparency worked. I told him I needed him to withdraw my reference from any further use. Immediately, he looked surprised, then concerned, then measured. He said withdrawing it now would look strange. He said it could suggest instability. He said it might undo the progress that had been made. He said he didn't want my name associated with unnecessary friction. I said my name was already associated. He leaned back and studied me, not defensively but thoughtfully. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said I was reacting emotionally to a technical process. He said risk professionals sometimes struggled when their tools worked outside controlled environments. He said I was used to managing exposure, not being part of it. The calmness of the statement chilled me. I told him this wasn't a discussion. I said my involvement ended now. I said he was not to reference me again in any context, formal or informal. He nodded. He said he respected that. He said he wished I'd trusted him sooner with my concerns. He said things might have unfolded differently. That night I didn't sleep. Not from fear. From inventory. I went back through our conversations in my head. Not for betrayal but for sequence. I could see now how carefully the asks had escalated. How concern had turned into credibility. How reassurance had been repurposed as leverage. The next morning I emailed compliance myself. I disclosed the reference. I clarified its scope. I stated explicitly that I did not consent to its continued use, and that any reliance on it should be reevaluated. The response came within hours. Thank you. Noted. Understood. That was when I knew it had gone further than I'd realized. When I told him what I'd done, He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said I'd overcorrected. He said institutions remembered disruptions longer than they remembered favors. He said I might have made things harder for both of us. I said there was no both anymore. He didn't argue. He gathered his things calmly, like someone closing out a position. At the door he turned and said one last thing. He said he hadn't meant to misuse my trust. He said he just recognized its value before I did. After he left, I sat alone and noticed how steady my breathing was. That surprised me. The system corrected itself faster than I expected. By Monday morning, the internal review summary had been amended. The language softened. The line about third-party references was gone, replaced with something blander about documentation alignment. No apology. No explanation. Just revision. That was how institutions admitted error. Later that day, an update crossed my desk about contractor exposure. One account had been downgraded, not terminated, reclassified, bonding limits adjusted, additional guarantees required. I knew without asking that it was his. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance. He texted that evening. Just once. He said the credit union had asked for additional assurances. He said the tone had shifted again. He said he hadn't expected things to tighten so quickly. I didn't respond. 2 days later he called. I let it go to voicemail. He said he wished I'd talked to him before escalating things. He said institutions panicked when insiders pulled away suddenly. He said he felt blindsided. He said he thought we were navigating this together. I deleted the message without replaying it. At work, no one mentioned it to me directly. That mattered. It meant my disclosure had landed where it should have. Contained, procedural, unpersonalized. I hadn't triggered a spectacle. I triggered a correction. A week later, another briefing noted a reduction in exposure tied to security sector accounts. The phrasing was neutral. The impact was not. I told myself that consequences were not my responsibility. They were his. What surprised me was how quickly the emotional residue drained away once the professional channel was closed. Without the low hum of implication, there was nothing to process. No debate. No narrative to defend. The last contact came as an email, not from him but from a different credit union, one I had no relationship with. They asked whether I was affiliated with a contractor seeking favorable terms, and whether my name had been offered as informal assurance. I replied once, "No, I have no affiliation. Please remove my name from your records." They confirmed within minutes. After that, the silence held. I didn't check his social media. I didn't ask mutual acquaintances. There were none, really. Our connection had existed in a narrow corridor between roles. Once the corridor closed, there was no reason to wander nearby. The thing I kept returning to wasn't anger. It was the realization that trust, once abstracted, could be traded without either party acknowledging the transaction. After it ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt calibration. The days returned to their original texture. Meetings regained their edges. Decisions stopped echoing after I made them. When my phone rang, it belonged to work again, not to some overlapping concern that needed interpretation before response. I noticed the change physically. My shoulders lowered. My jaw stopped setting itself before conversations. I stopped rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. The vigilance that had slipped in quietly left the same way. At work, nothing followed me. No side glances. No cautionary conversations. The machine had absorbed the adjustment and moved on. That was the point of systems. When they functioned correctly, they corrected without drama. One morning, a junior analyst asked me how I decided when to intervene versus when to step back. It was an honest question, not about him, not about anyone specific. I said intervention was appropriate when risk was internal. I said distance was necessary when risk tried to borrow authority instead of earning it. I didn't think of him while I said it. Weeks later, I ran into him once more by accident. Same pharmacy. Different line. He looked thinner. Tired in a way that didn't ask for recognition. When our eyes met, he nodded. I nodded back. Nothing else passed between us. That felt right. At home that evening, I opened a window and let the air move through the apartment. I didn't need to mark the end with anything ceremonial. The ending had already occurred where it mattered, in scope, in language, in access. Before sleep, one thought surfaced, clean and uncharged. Trust wasn't what had failed. Placement had. I turned off the light. The room held its shape. My phone stayed silent. I slept.